I'm currently in Ottawa, and I have 3 completely identical boxes here. And I'm going to send each one back home to my own address in Toronto, but this one will be shipped with Purolator, this one with Canada Post, and this one with UPS using the cheapest rate available. Now, each box also has a tracker inside so that I can follow every step of its journey. And while I'm going to be in Toronto and waiting to see which one of these boxes is going to get to me first, I wanted to take a more in-depth look into Canada Post and figure out how they managed to lose more than $10 million every single day. But before doing that, let's go ahead and send these boxes to, well, myself. Can I send this one to Toronto? All in all, UPS cost me $32.16. So now let's go to Purolator. Hi there, can I send this with Purolator to Toronto? Of course. And my Purolator package is now also gone. The closest location I could find was inside of Staples, and it cost me a whopping $80.46, also for just regular ground shipping. So that was quite pricey. But now let's go to Canada Post. Hi there. Can I just send this to Toronto?
For sure.
And Canada Post was the cheapest option. I just paid $22.48, which is pretty good. But I don't know, maybe they need to charge a little bit more, because last year they reported a record-breaking loss of $1.57 billion. And in order for me to understand how they are in such a dire financial position, we need to travel back in time to 1981. And we discovered that prior to 1981, Canada Post was structured as a federal department, just like Transport or Health Canada. It was headed by a politician who answered various questions in the Parliament, and they had to go through long political debates to discuss things that should have been relatively simple business decisions. And that structure just didn't work, because even back then, Canada Post was already losing more than $500 million every single year. But of course, politicians knew that there was a problem, so the idea of transforming Canada Post into a more efficient organization had been floating around Ottawa for many years. But finally, it was Pierre Trudeau's Liberal government that in 1981 sealed the deal and made Canada Post a Crown corporation. Now, you might ask, what is the difference between a federal department and a Crown corporation? And that's a really good question. The main difference is that a Crown corporation is structured more like a real business, even though it's still fully owned by the government. So it will have a CEO, a board of directors, and, well, in theory, it should be much more efficient. And I think in general, it was a good positive change for Canada Post. But the new structure also came with 2 rules that were written directly into its Corporation Act. The first one was that Canada Post must deliver to every single address in Canada. And 2, it must do so without any taxpayer help, meaning it also must be fully self-sufficient. And at first, this transformation worked, because by the late 1980s, Canada Post returned to profitability for the first time in many years. They did it by more than doubling the cost of stamps, which was now a much easier process that didn't get stuck in long political debates. And also, starting in 1985, a lot of new housing developments started getting community mailboxes, just like these. And they're dramatically cheaper to service versus door-to-door delivery. Even today, it costs Canada Post about $162 per community mailbox per year to service versus about $284 per address when it's on a door-to-door delivery. So that's about 75% more expensive. But by the early 90s, there was also another opportunity and also a huge threat that was looming on the horizon, because Canada Post's legal monopoly on lettermail was not really going to be enough to sustain the company for long. Parcel market was also growing quite aggressively, and American companies like FedEx and UPS, they were really starting to dominate Canadian parcel market, something that Canada Post had no monopoly on. So the government decided to make quite an interesting decision. You see, there's a Canadian company with a bit of a weird history. Its name actually comes from the oil filter industry, specifically from the process of putting dirty oil in and pure oil coming out later. Pure oil later, Purolator. And for a while, Purolator, the Canadian courier company, was actually owned by this American filter manufacturer. It's extremely confusing, but the point is that by 1987, the American filter manufacturer sold off its Canadian courier branch fully to Canadian investors. It became one of the biggest domestic couriers. It just retained the original Purolator name. And Canada Post recognized that, well, if it wanted to compete with the likes of UPS and FedEx, building something from scratch would take many, many years. So in 1993, Canada Post made a decision to acquire a majority stake in Purolator. Now we'll come back to Purolator in a second, because in addition to try to grow and make the corporation as efficient as possible, the government made a decision to close about 3,000 rural post office locations. And this is where they hit a bit of a wall, because when rural members of parliament, when they pushed back, well, the government backed down. So instead, in 1994, back then Canada's Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, he did a full 180. And he imposed a full moratorium, meaning that now Canada Post was prohibited from being able to close any of those locations, and that rule would stay in place for the next 31 years. But I think it's still fair to say that the time from roughly early 90s to late 2000s was like the golden era of Canada Post, because thanks to all of those optimizations, it was profitable most of those years. But the good times would not last for too much longer. Because by 2006, there were several developments that started chipping away at Canada Post's business. And the biggest one was the transition from paper to online mail. You see, back then, an average Canadian household used to get dozens of bills, physically, in their mailboxes. Credit cards, gas, hydro, phone, etc., etc. But by 2015, most of those bills had moved to online portals. But the problem was that when those huge companies were sending their statements to their customers every single month, it was a highly predictable recurring volume. It was really Canada Post's bread and butter. And when those companies started prompting their customers to switch to online billing and save the planet in this nice little green font, but let's face it, it was never about the planet, it was always about the money, all of a sudden those companies started saving hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. Because delivering a statement to their customer in a PDF format would maybe cost a fraction of a cent in their server fees, versus delivering an actual paper mail would maybe cost 30 or 40 cents. So multiplied by many, many, many different customers, by many months, and you get the point. And then by 2007, the iPhone came out, and of course it took some time for smartphones to really catch on, but that made digital billing even more frictionless, and it helped to convert the demographic that still wanted to stick with paper. So in addition to customers now preferring those online portals, something else was happening quietly in the background. Companies like Amazon, Intelcom, and others, they were growing rapidly. But the thing is, those companies, they hire their delivery drivers as independent contractors, not employees. And that legal distinction, it has a huge difference, because with independent contractors, there are no pensions, there are no sick days, there are no health benefits. Usually, they must even use their own vehicle, pay for their own gas, and absorb those depreciation costs. But Canada Post uses a different model, where its employees are part of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, or CUPW for short. And they have some very interesting protections in place that do not exist anywhere else, which is a good segue to talk about the union itself in a bit more detail. To start, CUPW workers have a job that, well, it's pretty hard. Sometimes mail carriers must walk up to 20 kilometers a day in cold Canadian weather all year round. But they also have full health benefits, no layoffs for anybody who's been with the company for 5 or more years, and also a guaranteed monthly pension upon retirement. And speaking of that pension, there's something that a lot of people get wrong about Canada Post. You might think that since the company must pay those pensions, that's why it's bleeding money, but that is actually not true, because currently Canada Post pension plan has $33 billion of assets under its management. That is $7 billion more than it needs to pay for all of those pensions that have already been promised. So it's about 130% funded. It's so well funded, in fact, that Canada Post has been restricted from being able to put more money into it. But even, I would say, with those relatively good benefits, since Canada Post became a Crown Corporation in 1981, CUPW has been involved in at least 7 big strikes. And several of those have ended through a mandatory back-to-work legislation rather than an agreement between the two parties. But regardless though, Canada Post still needs to somehow reduce the size of its workforce because it currently accounts for almost 70% of its entire operational cost. But remember, there are no layoffs for anybody who's been with the company for more than 5 years. So for the corporation, in order to reduce the number of people that work for it, they can only rely on attrition. And attrition simply means waiting for natural departures, like retirements. So over the next decade or so, Canada Post expects that roughly 30,000 people are either going to retire or maybe leave voluntarily. So what kind of solutions have been proposed over the years to fix this crisis? Well, first we gotta admit the fact that letter mail, it is not coming back, because since 2006, the volume of letter mail decreased from 5.5 to just 2 billion. But in that same time frame, the number of addresses increased from 14 to 18 million. So now remember, Canada Post Corporation Act and its two rules, where it must serve every single address, but it must be fully self-sufficient. At this point, it almost sounds impossible to do. But the very first serious attempt to fix this came in 2013 when Stephen Harper's Conservative government, they supported Canada Post's 5-point plan. And the biggest move of that plan was the conversion of 5 million Canadian addresses to community mailboxes. Because remember, these are dramatically cheaper to service. So over the next couple of years, this plan kicked in and about 840,000 addresses were successfully converted. But then, in 2015, Justin Trudeau's Liberal government came in and they campaigned against this entire idea and they won. So immediately those conversions were frozen, so 840,000 addresses that were converted to community mailboxes, they stayed on community mailboxes, but the remaining 4 million addresses, well, they were on door-to-door and they were pretty much left untouched. They stayed on door-to-door delivery. And here's also something that's quite interesting, because for a few years after Harper's plan kicked in, Canada Post came back to profitability. Because those 840,000 addresses that were converted to community mailboxes, well, they were saving the corporation about $100 million a year. Now, early e-commerce was booming, there was also a huge stamp price increase, and then Trudeau's government came in and kind of scrapped the entire plan. So by 2018, the losses returned, and they never really stopped since. Which means that from 2018 to 2024, Canada Post lost money every single year. And then, right before Christmas in 2024, CUPW workers walked off the job in a national strike. But a lot of people still had to send things, so they went to competition, UPS, Purolator, FedEx, and unfortunately, a lot of those customers never really came back. But finally, in September of 2025, something or somebody snapped in Ottawa, and they introduced 4 radical changes. First, they now wanted to convert the remaining 4 million addresses to community mailboxes. They also lifted rural post office moratorium, so now Canada Post could start closing locations depending on business needs and their performance. They also wanted to relax non-urgent mail standards so that it could travel by ground instead of air. And finally, they wanted to rework the whole stamp price increase model so that it could be done a little bit quicker. Not bad, right? Moving in the right direction. But the union's response was very, very quick, because in the weeks that followed, CUPW went on yet another national strike. Their argument was that Canada Post's losses were not their fault, and workers should not be the ones who need to pay to fix them. And since early 2026, Canada Post and the union, they've been stuck in a bit of a limbo, because they reached a tentative agreement, but it must still be voted on and ratified. And if that vote passes, then Canada Post is going to get weekend delivery to stay competitive, the ability to close 100 previously protected post offices, and also 3 years of labor peace, meaning no more strikes. But if that vote fails, the entire transformation plan collapses as well. But Canada Post leadership has been quite clear, saying that, well, even if it passes, then Canada Post is not going to get to a break-even point anytime soon. And while Canada Post was asking Ottawa for its second bailout last year in 2025, Purolator was having a really good year because, well, Canada Post's parcel volume declined while Purolator's increased, which means that, well, quite a lot of customers who decided not to ship with Canada Post anymore, they moved to Purolator as an alternative, which I guess is kind of okay because they did not leave Canada Post's family per se. Again, they own 91% of Purolator. It's a very weird part to this entire story because the parent company is kind of struggling, but its own subsidiary is benefiting from it. So I wanted to ask myself, is it good that Canada Post's business is shifting to Purolator? It depends really who you ask, because from a Canadian shareholder's perspective, it's better than losing customers to American competition like UPS or FedEx. From a union's perspective, it's absolutely catastrophic because their own employer is now benefiting from their strikes by diverting work to Purolator, which is also unionized, by the way, but they just have weaker leverage and weaker protections. From Canada Post's management perspective, it's a very weird lifeline because Purolator kind of helps to soften those losses, but it doesn't fix operational problems. And from a national policy view, it raises a very awkward question. Because if Canadians can get good and reliable service from a Canadian company like Purolator, then why do we need Canada Post at all? Maybe we need it to reach those very remote communities where Purolator or UPS or FedEx will never bother to go? I don't know. It's a very delicate and definitely an awkward question. But here's the thing. For the past 45 years, Canada Post has been asked to deliver to every single address in Canada, all without any taxpayer help. And over in Germany, they actually realized that, well, those two goals, they simply do not fit. They privatized Deutsche Post, which then acquired DHL, which is now this huge mega logistics company. In Denmark, PostNord at the end of 2025 just delivered its last lettermail, ending 400 years of Danish letter delivery. And I'm just providing those examples just to show you that, well, those two countries, they already made a choice. And Canada, it hasn't made one really. So we are just kind of stuck losing $10 million every single day. But again, while much smarter people than me out there are trying to fix this problem and figure out what to do with Canada Post, let's go back to those boxes that I sent to myself at the beginning of this video and see what happened to them. Drum roll. The winner of this race is Purolator, and I mean for 80 bucks it better be, but it made its way from Ottawa to Toronto in 66 hours and 13 minutes. And it started moving relatively fast after I dropped it off. I think it got moved to a sorting facility nearby Ottawa, sat there for a bit, and then overnight it was driven from there to Toronto's sorting facility, where again it sat for a bit, but finally it was delivered to me. So Purolator is the winner. Second place, Canada Post. I was a little bit surprised, but it got delivered to me about 4 hours after Purolator. The story was a little bit different. It sat in its initial location for about 45 hours. Then it was picked up, moved to its own sorting facility in Ottawa. Then overnight, just like Purolator, it was driven from there to Toronto's sorting facility, where it also sat for a little bit, and then finally it was delivered to me. So Canada Post is our, well, gets a silver medal. Our loser in this race is UPS. It sat in its initial location the longest, for about 50 hours, where then it was picked up, moved to its own sorting facility by Ottawa, and then overnight, just like the other two, it was also driven from Ottawa to Toronto's sorting facility, sat there for a bit, and then finally it was delivered to me. So UPS, unfortunately, our loser here. Before I fully conclude the video though, let's open up this box and see what's inside. Let's do it together. Okay, and let's do this, and make sure to be safe around the blade and see what's inside. What's this? It says subscribe. That's crazy. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, and don't forget to comment and subscribe.